Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we are going to focus on development during adulthood. And so, if you have not yet already watched the social and emotional development lecture, I would recommend that you watch that lecture first before getting into this particular lecture about as we develop in kind of the second half of life. And so, to get started today, when we talk about adulthood, know that we kind of divide adulthood into three main time periods. We have young adulthood, which is mid 20s until about 40 or so, middle adulthood from 40 to around 60, and then late adulthood, which would be 60 plus. And know that for each of these three categories, it's important that you understand some of the different social, the cognitive, and the physical changes that take place. We use these divisions for a number of reasons, but one reason we look at these three particular groups is because this is how Erickson divided up adulthood as well. And so in our last lecture, we talked about Erik Erikson, and when Erikson studies our social development over our lifetime, you may remember that there are 8 stages. We discussed to some extent kind of the first 5 in the last lecture. So today we are going to look at the last 3 stages. Before we get into those 3 stages, keep in mind that as we are looking at development, there are a couple of different ways that psychologists may want to study how we change over time. And so, when we are studying change in relation to time, there are some approaches we could use. Sometimes we use what's called a longitudinal study. And for a longitudinal study, this is where we take one group of people and we study them over a long period of time. And so, if we are curious, for example, about how cardiovascular health changes from infancy to childhood to adolescence to adulthood, we could take one group of people and we could study them, throw them on a treadmill for 20 minutes and study their cardiovascular health. And then we do it 5 years later, 10 years later, so on and so forth. It's a longitudinal study. Maybe we're curious about how depression impacts adolescents compared to how depression impacts adults. When we do longitudinal studies, there's a clear advantage, and that is it's the same people. And so the variable that is changing is age. The disadvantage of a longitudinal study, of course, is that it takes a long period of time. If you want to know how depression impacts a teenager compared to someone in their 50s, well, then you need to wait several decades before you get those particular results. Another way to study this and get results much faster is through what we call a cross sectional study. And with a cross sectional study, you simply divide groups by their age group itself. And so you can think you study a group of people, then you go across the parking lot or across town and you study a different group of people that are separated by age. If you're curious about how uh, remote learning impacts elementary school students or high school students, you could study a group of elementary school students and the very next day study a group of high school students. It would be a cross sectional study. The advantage, it's very efficient, it goes very quickly. The disadvantage, of course, is the fact that they are different people and there could be different results not because of their age, but because perhaps they have different experiences or something like that. So let's go ahead and look at young adulthood. Again, mid 20s to about 40 or so. Some things to note about young adulthood. First of all, Erickson calls this the intimacy stage. The fifth stage, according to Erickson, remember that's the fidelity stage when you're trying to figure out who you are. It is the next stage, the intimacy stage, that Erickson says, okay, you've figured out who you are. Now you want to figure out who you want to spend the rest of your life with. So it's in the intimacy stage that you start to build long lasting relationships with people outside of your family. And so, Erickson would argue that a lot of the good friends that you have in high school may not continue to be your greatest friends when you're an adult because you don't even really know who you are yet, and neither do they. But the friends that you make in your early 20s, the people that you meet in your early 20s, you are more likely to stay close to those and perhaps, find someone that you love and get married to them during this time period of the intimacy stage. There are what we call social clock pressures during all of life, but there are a ton of social clock pressures that take place in the intimacy stage. Social clock pressures are these kind of general time periods for when a culture says that you should do something. So, approximately how old you should be when you move out of your parents' home, when you go to college, when you get your first job, when you get married, when you have kids, right? There are all these like benchmarks for when these typically take place. And as I mentioned, there's a ton of them in the intimacy stage. And if someone misses kind of their time period, then it can add lots of stress and anxiety. It's the idea of, I thought I would have met someone by now and been married by now, or I thought I would have had kids by now, or I thought I would have been out of my parents' basement by now, or whatever it may be. That ties back to this idea of social clock. I have there the 5-to-1 ratio in divorce. Divorce rates, surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, are actually on a decline. Divorce rates were every decade were going up for the last 70 years. We have divorce rates going up, going up, going up, and you've likely heard stories about how divorce rates are at nearly 50%. In other words, everyone who's getting married, it's like a coin flip whether or not they will stay together. But what we have seen over the last 10 years or so is this drop in divorce rates. And part of that is because people are waiting longer to get married. Um, Traditionally, at least in the United States, people were getting married at a relatively young age, early 20s, right? In the case of your parents and grandparents, it might even be late teens getting married. Erickson would say, you don't quite know who you are yet, so it'd be difficult to marry the right person. Um, as people wait longer, have a better understanding of themselves, divorce rates are declining and going down. But there is still this kind of 5-to-1 ratio. And the idea behind the 5-to-1 ratio is simply, when you think about your experiences, lots of research is going to say that you need 5 good experiences for every one bad experience. And so, if you reflect on the day and how many times you get into an argument or you feel upset, and you kind of compare that to all the times that you laugh and have fun and have, a good time together, the 5-to-1 ratio is kind of this magic number of whether or not a relationship will likely exist. And it's not always just divorce. You can think about this with friends as well. If every single time you're hanging out with someone you find that you're in a bad mood, there's a good chance that that relationship probably won't last. In regard to physical ability, it is in the intimacy stage that we tend to see this peak. And it starts to decline really in the kind of mid to late 20s. But as far as things like strength and cardiovascular health, reaction time, these all peak usually in young adulthood. With women, it tends to peak a little bit sooner than with men. Um, but both of them do start to decline toward the kind of the latter part of this stage. The seventh stage, according to Erickson, which would be middle adulthood, is what we call the generativity stage. And with again, crisis in each stage, right? So in this seventh stage, we're thinking around 40 till around 60. Generativity, like generating something, creating something, or stagnation. You're likely familiar with that idea of stagnation, not moving, being stuck. It kind of makes sense, right? And so if you have someone who's 50 years old, it's possible that they've been in the same job for over 20 years. Maybe they've been married to the same person for over 20 years. They've lived in the same neighborhood for over 20 years. And you can see how emotionally and cognitively, you have a person who asks themselves, am I still being productive? Like, am I still creating? Am I still generating? Do I still have a purpose? Or am I stuck? Do I feel like I'm just doing the same thing every day of my life? And to an extent, that helps explain this idea of a midlife crisis. um, it should be noted that lots of psychologists argue that few people truly experience a midlife crisis. But for those who do, for those who struggle to retain their identity when they're in their 40s and 50s, it could be this element of just feeling stagnant, of feeling like they aren't doing anything new in their life. Of all of the stages, according to Erickson, it is in middle adulthood that your strength and endurance is most dependent on lifestyle. Um, if you think about kind of how that works, even if you round up a bunch of adolescents, even if you have adolescents that aren't very physically fit, for the most part, you could go down to the track and run around the track a couple of times, right? Um, as we get older, people's physical ability and ability to run around the track a couple of times, that is going to become more and more dependent on lifestyle. And then you would think, well, why is it middle adulthood? Why is it not late adulthood? And the reality is, when you get to late adulthood, even those who are physically fit are still going to be going kind of slow around the track. So when we look at all of the stages, it's middle adulthood that has the most dependence on diet, exercise, those things. It's one of those gentle reminders that it's really difficult to get into good physical habits as far as working out and staying healthy when you're in middle adulthood, because it's more difficult at that time in life. So try to establish those good habits today when you're young, and it'll make it a lot easier on you in the future. It also marks the end of reproductive years as women experience menopause and can no longer produce children. And this can, for some women, be very freeing and kind of like this great, wonderful experience. And for other women, can lead to depression and feeling upset that this is like a period of their time that is over, essentially. So how menopause impacts women has been studied greatly, and the reality is we can't really put it in one box or another. It impacts women different in different ways. And then the final stage, late adulthood, this would be around 60 plus. Erickson calls this the integrity stage. And the idea behind the integrity stage essentially is when your hair is turning gray and you realize that you have many more yesterdays than you have tomorrows, there's a lot of reflection and there's not a lot of time to make adjustments and change. And so the conflict, according to Erickson, is integrity. Did I live a good life? Did I do what I was supposed to do? Or despair, which is quite depressing. This idea of having regret. Now, lots of psychologists believe that the vast majority of people who reach this last stage of life, they do in fact experience integrity. In fact, lots of studies have shown that people are among the happiest they ever are in their life when they are in late adulthood. People tend to retain more positive memories. They have kind of rose colored glasses where they look back fondly on the past. Mood is more stable. And so, a negative event, not only will it move a person less on the mood spectrum, but also will have less of an effect as far as the longevity of a negative experience. And so this idea of kind of the grumpy old grandpa, although there are certainly examples of that, for the majority of Americans, majority of people, they tend to be fairly happy in late adulthood. We do see a decline in different physical abilities, right? Sensory reaction times, things like our vision, things like our hearing, this all tends to decline. How quickly we can respond tends to decline. It's one reason why people who are in this stage are second only to teenagers when it comes to car accidents and driving automobiles. And then an interesting look at the difference between what we call fluid and crystallized intelligence. Crystallized intelligence, if you think about, I like to compare this to like a stream or a river, right? If a stream or a river is fluid, it's moving, right? If it's crystallized, frozen, it's not moving. Well, when we think about intelligence, crystallized intelligence is going to continue to progress as you age. The idea behind crystallized intelligence is this is more like knowledge. It's your understanding of information and facts and things that have happened. Whereas fluid intelligence is your ability to adapt, your ability to learn something new, and that begins to decline in middle adulthood. And so I always say you can remember it like your grandparents may know all of the answers on Jeopardy, but they don't know how to program their television remote, right? And so they're not stupid, right? But learning new technology, learning new processes, this can be difficult because that requires fluid intelligence, whereas the understanding of factual information, that continues to progress throughout your life. It's interesting when we look at memory and how memory changes as we get older. There are a couple of ways in which memory does decline, specifically with old age. Specifically, things like rote memory starts to go down. Rote memory is just memorizing things that carry no actual meaning, like memorizing a grocery list, for example. Psychologists they've done both longitudinal and cross-sectional studies of memory and have found that memorizing random lists of random terms, that goes down as you age, as opposed to memory of things that carry actual importance and meaning in their life. And another thing that declines with memory as you get older is what we call prospective memories. And we talked about this in our memory unit. We have prospective memories and retrospective memories. Retrospective memories is what you probably think about when you think about memory. A retrospective memory is a memory for something that has already happened, like your last birthday or a Chiefs Super Bowl win. Whereas a prospective memory is a memory for something that has not yet happened. I need to remember to pick up the dry cleaning. I need to remember to take my medicine this evening, right? Those are prospective memories. Those are memories without memory cues, and that starts to decline with age. It's one of those reasons why it's important that we set reminders and things so that we don't forget to do stuff. And then finally, if we're going to talk about memory, um, there's usually the conversation about Alzheimer's disease, because Alzheimer's disease is related to memory and specifically to memory decline. What happens with Alzheimer's disease, what we have found is that the brain itself is literally starting to shrink. The neurons themselves are starting to shrivel and deteriorate, specifically neurons that create acetylcholine. So I have ACH there. You may remember talking about acetylcholine in our second unit. That is one of those neurotransmitters that helps with the formation of memory. And what happens with Alzheimer's is we start to experience symptoms of dementia. Keep in mind that Alzheimer's and dementia are not synonymous. Alzheimer's is a cause for dementia, but you can have other things that also cause dementia. For example, experiencing a stroke can lead to dementia. It's just that Alzheimer's is one of the leading causes of dementia. And I have some symptoms there that you may be familiar with in regard to what dementia looks like. There's this kind of predictable progression of cognitive decline. And so it usually begins with an inability to recall things that people should recall. We're not talking about forgetting where you put your phone or your keys. We're talking about forgetting the names of your own children. This is usually followed by emotional instability and irritability, and then confusion, disorientation. Eventually, people with Alzheimer's may become mute. Unable to talk, and then in the long term, with advanced Alzheimer's, it will be fatal. It's an incredibly sad disease. The good news is, I genuinely believe we are very, very close at finding a cure to Alzheimer's disease. Current research has found in lab rats medications that can slow and to an extent reverse the deterioration of these particular neurons. And so, anyone who's been impacted by Alzheimer's, with a parent or grandparent, I know that I have. This is great news to know that hopefully this at some point will be a disease of the past. And then our last slide for this lecture is some other elements of just kind of what happens while living old. First of all, we have a larger population of the elderly than we ever have before. This is kind of coming from two different ends. One, we have a lower infant mortality rate, and two, we are able to live longer because of modern medicine and technology. And so the result is we have this exploding population of the elderly. And now this can strain different systems. This can strain hospital systems, economic systems, as far as supporting people who are within this particular group who may not be able to work and be productive in that particular mean, but still obviously require resources on a society. And so it's an interesting situation where we have this growing population in this particular group. As we age, and as you likely know, cells duplicate, and as cells duplicate, it's kind of like making a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, and you can see that the quality level declines. Well, that happens with chromosomes as well. The ends of your chromosomes are called telomeres, and what we have found is that through cell duplication, those telomeres shorten. What is the result? Well, the result is your body doesn't recover as well as it used to. And so you take, for example, some common surgery. If you take a hernia surgery, right? Well, an 18-year-old recovering from a hernia surgery may take a couple of weeks, whereas someone who's in their 60s recovering from the exact same surgery may end up taking a few months. And the reason, again, is because the body simply doesn't recover the way that it used to when it was younger. The immune system starts to wear down and really struggles with major illnesses like influenza, pneumonia. Um, Keep in mind, and this can be a tricky question. I've seen this mix some students up. Kind of, I don't know if I want to say smaller, but more minor illnesses like the common cold as you get older, you actually do a better job fighting those types of illnesses. And that is the result of just having decades and decades of antibodies building up. And so when you have someone who's in their 60s or 70s, they may be less susceptible to getting a cold. However, something like the flu or COVID could certainly impact them to a greater degree than it would someone who's in their teens or 20s. All right, I felt like I was going a million miles per hour for this lecture. If you have questions, let me know. And as always, have a great weekend and good luck.